Imagine stepping into a humid, rotting oven. It is August 7th, 1942. The temperature is 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but the suffocating humidity makes it feel like you are trying to breathe hot soup. You are a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, gripping a bolt-action Springfield rifle, staring over the steel ramp of a landing craft at a dark green island that looks like a prehistoric monster rising from the Pacific Ocean. This is Guadalcanal. Welcome to the meat grinder. If you want to understand how wars are actually won, not in the sanitized pages of a military textbook, but in the mud, the blood, and the rusted steel of shattered fleets, you are in the exact right place. I am glad you are here with us on the channel today. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below what you think is the single most important factor in a brutal war of attrition. Is it overwhelming firepower, or is it pure, stubborn logistics? We are going to find out right now. To understand why thousands of young Americans and Japanese men were about to slaughter each other over a worthless strip of jungle, we have to rewind the clock. The roots of this bloodbath do not start at Pearl Harbor, but 20 years earlier, in 1922. The Washington Naval Treaty was signed, limiting the battleship tonnage of the major world powers. The Japanese Empire felt deeply disrespected, restricted to a 5-to-5-to-3 ratio in capital ships compared to the United States and Great Britain. This perceived insult birthed the Japanese naval doctrine known as Kantai Kessen, or the decisive battle doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew they could not outbuild the industrial might of the United States. Therefore, their entire military philosophy was built around forcing the American fleet to cross the vast Pacific, whittling it down with submarines and long-range aircraft, before destroying the exhausted remnants in a massive winner-take-all clash of battleships. The United States, meanwhile, had developed War Plan Orange. American strategists knew that a war in the Pacific would require a grueling, island-hopping campaign across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, requiring a logistical train unlike anything the world had ever seen. So why Guadalcanal? It is a miserable speck of dirt in the Solomon Islands, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide. But on a strategic map, it sits right on the throat of the supply lifeline between the United States and Australia. In the summer of 1942, American reconnaissance discovered that Japanese labor battalions were building an airfield on the northern coast of Guadalcanal. If that airfield was completed, Japan could launch Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers to sever the shipping lanes. Australia would be entirely cut off. The Pacific War could be lost before America even had a chance to fully mobilize. Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, saw this threat clearly. King was a ruthless, abrasive man who supposedly shaved with a blowtorch, but he understood the brutal geometry of naval strategy. He demanded an immediate offensive, which was designated Operation Watchtower. Why launch a major amphibious offensive when the US military was still reeling and recovering from the disaster at Pearl Harbor? Because time is the one resource you cannot manufacture in a shipyard. If they waited for the perfect moment, The Japanese airfield would be operational, and the strategic window would slam shut. The forces converging on this island could not have been more different in their equipment, their doctrine, and their mindset. The tip of the American spear was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift. These men were known as the Old Breed. Many of the senior non-commissioned officers were hardened veterans of the Banana Wars in Central America. They brought a wealth of jungle fighting experience, reminiscent of the brutal Seminole Wars, fought in the swamps of Florida a century earlier. But their equipment was shockingly outdated. They were going into combat, looking more like a World War I army than a modern fighting force. They carried the M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle, not the revolutionary semi-automatic M1 Garand that the Army was beginning to issue. They carried raising submachine guns, a weapon so sensitive to dirt and rust that Marines would soon be throwing them into rivers out of pure frustration. Their logistics were an absolute nightmare. Because Operation Watchtower was thrown together in just a few weeks, it earned the cynical nickname Operation Shoestring. Ships were combat-loaded so poorly that heavy artillery was buried under mountains of rotting rations, making rapid deployment impossible. Waiting for them, or soon to be fed into the meat grinder, was the Japanese 17th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake. The Japanese infantryman was arguably the toughest light infantry soldier on the planet at that time. They were trained to survive on a handful of rice and dried fish, marching incredible distances through impenetrable terrain. Their doctrine favored aggressive infiltration, night attacks, and the psychological shock of the banzai charge, relying on spiritual superiority to overcome American firepower. But their logistical doctrine was fundamentally broken. They viewed supply lines as an afterthought, relying on the warrior spirit to sustain troops in the field. To resupply their forces, they would have to rely on fast destroyers running down the central channel of the Solomon Islands, a body of water the Americans would soon call the Slot. The naval mismatch was even more terrifying. The Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the 8th Fleet at Rabaul was a masterclass in night fighting tactics. The Japanese trained relentlessly using massive, tripod-mounted night optics that allowed their lookouts to spot enemy ships in the pitch black long before radar could pick them up. More importantly, they possessed the deadliest naval weapon of the early war, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. This 24-inch diameter monster was fueled by pure oxygen. It weighed 6,000 pounds, carried a massive 1,080-pound high explosive warhead, and could travel 24 miles at a blistering 36 knots. Because it burned oxygen, it left almost no visible wake on the surface. Compare that to the American Mark 15 torpedo. The American weapon had a fraction of the range, a smaller warhead, and a magnetic exploder that was so defective it would often bounce harmlessly off the side of a Japanese ship without detonating. The American naval forces commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, did possess early radar systems. However, in the summer of 1942, American captains did not yet know how to properly interpret radar returns in the confined, island-cluttered waters of the Solomons. The radar scopes would light up with false echoes from nearby mountains, creating deadly confusion on the bridge. This technological and doctrinal clash was setting the stage for a modern Jutland, the massive World War I naval clash. But instead of battleships trading fire at 10 miles in broad daylight, this new Jutland would be fought in the pitch dark, at point-blank range, with heavy cruisers and destroyers ripping each other apart with torpedoes and 8-inch guns. Looming over this tactical imbalance was the grand strategic reality of industrial capacity. Japan was a fiercely martial society, but it possessed a dangerously fragile industrial base. They built exquisite, handcrafted machines of war, like the legendary A6M-0 fighter. But they could not replace those machines, or the elite, highly trained pilots who flew them, when they inevitably took losses. America, on the other hand, was a sleeping industrial titan just beginning to wake up. We were starting to churn out Liberty ships in mere weeks, standardizing mass production in a way the world had never witnessed. But in August 1942, that overwhelming industrial might was still spinning up in factories back in Detroit and Pittsburgh. The Marines, currently sitting in the landing craft off the coast of Guadalcanal, would have to fight with the meagre scraps they had on hand. The environment itself was perfectly designed to kill them. Guadalcanal is a green hell. Mount Popomanasiu rises over 7,000 feet in the center of the island, creating a jagged, impassable spine. The coastal plains are choked with kunai grass that grows 6 feet high and possesses edges sharp enough to slice right through a cotton uniform. The jungle canopy is so thick it blocks out the sun, creating a suffocating, permanent twilight at ground level. In this humid darkness, malaria-carrying mosquitoes breed in the millions, alongside giant centipedes and crocodiles. The island receives an average rainfall of over 120 inches a year, turning the volcanic soil into a bottomless, foul-smelling swamp. Despite the terrible odds, the operation had to go forward. On the night of August 6th, under the cover of a massive, heavy rain squall, American Task Force 61 slipped completely undetected into the channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. The fleet dropped anchor, and the sailors stood at general quarters, staring into the blackness. Down below the steel decks of the transport ships, thousands of young Marines checked the actions of their Springfield rifles one last time, listening to the dark water rushing past the hull. The rain began to clear. The sun was just about to break over the horizon, and with it, the curtain was about to rise on the most vicious, unforgiving campaign in the history of the Pacific. At 6:15 in the morning on August 7th, the heavy cruisers of the Allied naval force unleashed a deafening thunderclap that shattered the tropical dawn. 8-inch high explosive shells from the USS Quincy and the USS Vincennes tore into the dense jungle canopy of Guadalcanal, transforming ancient mahogany trees into millions of lethal flying splinters. The naval bombardment was meant to pulverize the Japanese defenders, but it was largely hitting empty jungle. Out on the water, thousands of Marines were climbing down cargo nets into 36-foot-long plywood and steel landing craft, officially known as LCVPs or Higgins boats. The flat-bottomed boats circled in the water, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with the stench of churning salt water and nervous sweat. When the signal was given, the boats formed a line abreast and charged toward Red Beach. The ramps dropped into the shallow surf, and the Marines of the 1st Division surged forward, expecting a wall of machine gun fire. Instead, they found silence. The Japanese construction battalions, terrified by the massive naval armada, had dropped their tools, abandoned their breakfasts, and fled deep into the jungle. The Marines pushed inland, securing the half-finished airfield by the following afternoon and renaming it Henderson Field, in honor of Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. It seemed too easy, and in warfare, when something seems too easy, you are usually walking into a trap. How do you secure a beachhead when the enemy simply refuses to fight on your terms? The answer came not from the jungle, but from the sea, in a nightmare of burning steel and drowning men. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet in Rabaul, had immediately assembled a strike force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. His objective was simple: steam down the slot at high speed, completely bypass the American carrier aircraft during the day, and annihilate the vulnerable transport ships unloading off Guadalcanal in the dead of night. The body of water, north of Guadalcanal and south of Florida Island, would soon earn a grim nickname from the sailors who fought there: Ironbottom Sound. On the night of August 8th, the weather was heavily overcast, creating a pitch-black environment with zero visibility. The Allied naval forces, guarding the approaches to the transport ships, were divided into 3 separate patrol groups. They were exhausted, having been at general quarters for over 48 hours. The ensuing Battle of Savo Island remains one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. The American destroyers USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot were equipped with early SC radar, patrolling the western approaches. But the radar operators were inexperienced, and the bulky vacuum tube technology struggled to differentiate between the solid mass of Savo Island and the incoming Japanese warships. Mikawa's column slipped right past them, completely undetected, moving at 26 knots. The Japanese did not need radar. Their lookouts were equipped with massive, tripod-mounted binoculars with specially ground lenses that gathered ambient starlight, allowing them to see the silhouettes of the Allied cruisers in the dark. At 1:36 in the morning, Japanese floatplanes that had been quietly circling overhead dropped brilliant magnesium parachute flares, instantly illuminating the Allied cruisers in a harsh, blinding white light. Before the American and Australian crews could even comprehend what was happening, the ocean was filled with the deadly wakes of Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes. The technical superiority of this Japanese weapon cannot be overstated. While American torpedoes were slow, unreliable, and left a highly visible trail of compressed air bubbles. The long lance was fueled by pure, compressed oxygen. It left almost no wake, meaning the first warning a ship had of an incoming attack was the catastrophic detonation of a 1,000-pound warhead against its hull. The Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra was struck by 2 torpedoes and hit by over 28-inch shells in the span of 3 minutes, turning the ship into a blazing slaughterhouse. The American cruisers USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes were systematically illuminated, targeted, and blown apart by concentrated Japanese gunfire and torpedoes. The confusion on the American ships was absolute. The captain of the Astoria actually ordered his gun crews to cease fire, believing they were accidentally shooting at friendly ships, only to be answered by another devastating Japanese salvo. In less than an hour, Mikawa had sunk 4 heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 Allied sailors, suffering almost no damage in return. This catastrophic night action is eerily reminiscent of the Battle of Chancellorsville during the American Civil War, where Confederate General Stonewall Jackson launched a massive surprise flank attack through the dense woods at dusk. Just like at Chancellorsville, the shock of a sudden, violent assault from an unexpected direction in low visibility completely paralyzed a numerically superior force. The Allied naval commanders at Savo Island were caught flat-footed. Their command structure broke down, and they were slaughtered in the dark. Fearing a dawn counterattack by American carrier planes, Mikawa withdrew before destroying the transport ships. But the damage was done. The American carrier commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, had already withdrawn his aircraft carriers the day before to preserve them, a highly controversial decision that left the amphibious force without air cover. Now, with the cruiser screen annihilated, the commander of the amphibious forces, Admiral Kelly Turner, was forced to withdraw the transport ships. They sailed away on the afternoon of August 9th, taking over half of the Marines' heavy equipment, construction gear, and vital supplies with them. General Vandegrift and his 16,000 Marines were stranded. They had only 37 days of food, very little barbed wire, no heavy earth-moving equipment, and a hostile jungle at their backs. They were entirely on their own. Vandegrift immediately ordered his men to dig in and establish a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. The airfield was the center of gravity for the entire campaign. If the Marines held the airstrip, American planes could control the skies during the day, sinking any Japanese supply ships that dared to approach. If the Japanese captured the airstrip, they would cut the supply lines to Australia, and the Marines would be wiped out. Using captured Japanese shovels, trucks, and even their own bare hands, the Marines desperately worked to finish the runway. By August 20th, the first planes of the Cactus Air Force arrived. The mud-soaked runway was paved with Marston matting, interlocking strips of perforated steel that prevented the heavy aircraft from sinking into the swamp. The backbone of this makeshift air force was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The Wildcat was a stubby, barrel-chested fighter plane. It could not outturn or outclimb the legendary Japanese A6M0. But it was built like a flying tank. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, and a thick, bulletproof windshield. A Wildcat could absorb hundreds of machine gun rounds and still bring its pilot home. The Zero, by contrast, sacrificed all armor for extreme maneuverability and range. If a Zero took a single burst of .50 caliber fire from a Wildcat's 6 wing-mounted machine guns, it usually exploded into a ball of fire. The Japanese High Command in Rabaul severely underestimated the strength of the American forces on Guadalcanal. They believed there were only about 2,000 disorganized Americans holding the airfield. In reality, Vandegrift had a heavily armed, dug-in division. To wipe out this perceived nuisance, the Japanese dispatched Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and a detachment of 900 elite infantrymen. Ichiki was a veteran of the war in China, supremely confident in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier. He landed east of the marine perimeter and immediately began a brutal 20-mile forced march through the jungle. On the night of August 20th, Ichiki's scouts probed the marine lines along the banks of a sluggish, crocodile-infested tidal estuary known as the Ilu River, which the Marines mistakenly called the Tenaru. How do you stop a fanatical infantry charge in the middle of a pitch-black jungle? You rely on the brutal geometry of interlocking fields of fire and the mechanical reliability of water-cooled machine guns. The Marines defending the sandspit at the mouth of the Ilu River were equipped with the M917A1 Browning heavy machine gun. This weapon was a masterpiece of industrial engineering. Unlike modern, air-cooled machine guns that require frequent barrel changes to prevent melting, the Browning featured a large bronze water jacket surrounding the barrel, holding about 7 pints of water. Fed by 250-round canvas belts of .30 caliber ammunition, this gun could fire continuously for hours. The gunners would literally fire until the water in the jacket boiled, generating steam that was captured in a condenser can and poured back into the jacket. If they ran out of water, Marines would urinate into the jacket to keep the gun in the fight. At 1:30 in the morning on August 21st, Ichiki ordered a massive frontal assault across the sandspit. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged out of the darkness, screaming banzai, firing their Arisaka rifles, and throwing grenades. The Marines waited until the Japanese were silhouetted against the dark water, and then they opened up. The M1917 Brownings hammered away at 600 rounds per minute, creating a solid wall of flying lead. The crossfire was mathematically precise, designed to cut down anything moving above the height of a man's knee. The Japanese charged into a meat grinder. When the human wave threatened to overwhelm the barbed wire, Marine 37mm anti-tank guns loaded canister shot. These were essentially giant shotgun shells filled with hundreds of steel balls. Fired at point-blank range, a single canister round would instantly clear a path of mutilation through the attacking ranks. Despite horrific casualties, Ichiki's men kept coming, driven by a doctrine that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. The fighting degenerated into savage hand-to-hand combat in the darkness, with Marines using ka-ba knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools to fight off Japanese soldiers who had breached the wire. As dawn broke, the sheer scale of the slaughter became apparent. The sandspit was covered with hundreds of mangled Japanese bodies. To finish off the remaining survivors hiding in a nearby coconut grove, Vandegrift deployed a platoon of M3 Stuart light tanks. The lightly armoured Stuarts rolled over the battlefield, firing canister shot into the trees and crushing the dead and dying under their steel treads. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the total destruction of his command, tore up his unit's regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. The Battle of the Tenaru was a massive psychological shock for the Japanese. It was the first time in the war that a Japanese infantry assault had been completely shattered by American ground forces. But the Japanese Empire was not about to give up. They began pouring reinforcements onto the island using a method the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Because the Cactus Air Force controlled the skies during the day, Japanese fast destroyers would load up with troops and supplies in the northern Solomons, sprint down the slot under the cover of darkness, dump their cargo on the beaches of Guadalcanal, and race back north before sunrise. It was an incredibly inefficient way to supply an army. Heavy artillery, trucks, and massive stockpiles of food could not be transported on the decks of destroyers. The Japanese soldiers arriving on the island were immediately placed on starvation rations, forced to hack their way through the suffocating jungle to reach the American lines. By early September, the Japanese had secretly amassed over 6,000 men in the jungle south of Henderson Field, under the command of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi realized that a frontal assault along the coast was suicide. Instead, he spent weeks hacking a trail through the dense jungle canopy to attack the marine perimeter from the south, an area Vandegrift believed was impassable. Kawaguchi's objective was a grassy, coral ridge that rose out of the jungle and pointed like a dagger directly at the airstrip. If the Japanese captured this ridge, they could fire their artillery straight down onto the parked American planes and roll right into the airfield. Defending this vital piece of terrain was the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, a man known to his troops as Red Mike, due to the fiery color of his hair and his explosive temper. The Raiders were an elite, lightly armed force, trained for hit-and-run tactics, not static defense. But they were all that stood between Kawaguchi and the total collapse of the American position. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, soon to be known forever as Bloody Ridge, began on the night of September 12th. The Japanese initiated the attack with a terrifying tactic. They used infiltration units to slip through the marine lines in the dark, cutting telephone wires connecting the front-line platoons to the artillery batteries in the rear. Then, they began lobbing flares into the sky, casting a sickly, dancing green light over the tall kunai grass. The Japanese infantry relied heavily on the Type 89 grenade discharger, commonly called the knee mortar by the Americans. This was a highly portable 50mm weapon that a single soldier could carry strapped to his leg. It did not actually fire from the knee. Doing so would shatter a man's thigh bone due to the recoil. Instead, it was braced against a log or the ground. The knee mortar allowed Japanese infantry to drop high explosive fragmentation rounds directly into Marine foxholes, with deadly accuracy, bridging the gap between hand grenades and heavy artillery. Coupled with the knee mortar was the Arisaka Type 38 bolt-action rifle. The Arisaka fired a 6.5 mm round that produced very little muzzle flash, making the sniper incredibly difficult to spot in the jungle. However, the rifle featured a sliding metal dust cover over the bolt that rattled loudly when the weapon was cycled. In the terrifying darkness of the ridge, Marines learned to listen for the distinct clatter of the dust cover to pinpoint Japanese positions before returning fire with their Thompson submachine guns and Browning automatic rifles. On the first night, Kawaguchi's forces managed to drive a wedge into the raider lines, engaging in brutal close-quarters fighting. But the main assault came the following night, September 13th. Over 3,000 Japanese infantrymen boiled out of the jungle, charging up the steep slopes of the Coral Ridge. Edson's men were pushed back, yard by bloody yard, consolidating around a small knoll at the very crest of the ridge. The situation was desperate. The raiders were running out of ammunition, and the Japanese were within a few hundred yards of the airfield. This desperate stand on Bloody Ridge is the Pacific War's exact equivalent to the defense of Little Round Top at the Battle of Gettysburg. Just as Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine had to hold the extreme left flank of the Union line against repeated Confederate assaults, Colonel Edson and his raiders had to hold the high ground at all costs. If the ridge fell, the entire defensive perimeter would be unhinged, and the battle would be lost. Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge when his ammunition ran out. Edson relied on a different kind of salvation, the heavy artillery of the 11th Marines. As the Japanese massed for a final overwhelming breakthrough, Edson called in artillery strikes directly onto his own front lines. The Marine artillerymen in the rear angled the barrels of their 105 mm howitzers as low as they could go. The trajectory was so flat that the 33-pound high-explosive shells were clipping the tops of the palm trees as they screamed over the heads of the defending raiders. The artillery barrage was apocalyptic. The ridge literally shook under the impact of thousands of shells. The explosions tore the Japanese formations to pieces, turning the slope of the ridge into a churned-up wasteland of shattered coral, shredded jungle, and pulverized bodies. The defensive firepower was simply too much for flesh and blood to withstand. By the morning of September 14th, Kawaguchi's brigade was broken. They left hundreds of dead on the slopes of the ridge and began a horrifying, starving retreat back into the deep jungle. The Marines had held the line on land, proving that American firepower and stubborn grit could break the myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle. But the victory on Bloody Ridge was only a temporary reprieve. The Imperial Japanese Navy was furious. The Tokyo Express had failed to dislodge the Americans, and the High Command in Tokyo realized that Guadalcanal was no longer a minor skirmish. It was the decisive battle they had been looking for. The skies above the island were thick with bombers, and the surrounding ocean was about to become a graveyard for thousands of sailors. The heavy hitters were maneuvering in the dark, and a clash of steel titans was coming that would turn the waters of the Solomons red. The failure to capture Bloody Ridge sent shockwaves through the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The Japanese High Command finally realized that the American presence on Guadalcanal was not a minor nuisance, but a heavily entrenched division capable of bleeding their empire dry. In response, they decided to escalate the conflict to an unprecedented level of violence. The plan was brutal and straightforward. The Imperial Japanese Navy would send a massive bombardment force, centered around the 14-inch guns of the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, down the slot to physically erase Henderson Field from the map. Once the American aircraft were pulverized into burning scrap metal, a massive convoy of slow-moving transport ships would land thousands of Japanese reinforcements to sweep the surviving Marines into the sea. How do you stop a pair of 30,000-ton battleships when you do not have any battleships of your own in the immediate area? You throw whatever you have into the meat grinder and pray it is enough. On the night of November 12, 1942, American Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led a heavily outgunned task force of cruisers and destroyers directly into the path of the Japanese bombardment fleet in the confined waters of Ironbottom Sound. What followed was one of the most chaotic, close-quarters naval engagements in human history. The battle was fought at such point-blank range that the massive Japanese battleships could not depress their main guns, low enough to hit the American destroyers scurrying around their hulls. American destroyers raked the towering pagodas of the Japanese battleships with 50-caliber machine guns, while 14-inch Japanese armor-piercing shells, weighing 1,500 pounds each, ripped through the thin steel of American cruisers like wet paper. The engagement devolved into a terrifying, uncoordinated barroom brawl with the lights shot out. Ships from both sides intermingled in the pitch black, firing at anything that moved. The USS San Francisco, Callahan's flagship, was hammered by devastating salvos from the Hiei, killing Callahan and most of his command staff on the bridge. Rear Admiral Norman Scott was also killed aboard the USS Atlanta when it was crippled by a Japanese torpedo and friendly fire. By dawn, the American task force was practically annihilated, but they had accomplished their desperate mission. The Japanese fleet, confused and disorganized by the suicidal ferocity of the American defense, turned around and retreated without firing a single shell at Henderson Field. But the Japanese were not finished. 2 nights later, on November 14th, they returned with the battleship Kirishima to finish the job. This time, the Americans were waiting with a technological ace up their sleeve. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, one of the foremost experts on the use of radar in the United States Navy, was waiting in the darkness with 2 modern 35,000-ton fast battleships the USS Washington and the USS South Dakota. The ensuing clash is a watershed moment in military history. It perfectly mirrors the famous clash between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia at Hampton Roads during the American Civil War. Just as the Monitor and the Virginia signaled the end of wooden sailing ships and the dawn of ironclads, the battleship action off Guadalcanal marked the exact moment when the human eye was rendered obsolete by the electronic pulse of radar. The USS South Dakota suffered a catastrophic electrical failure early in the battle, essentially blinding the ship and turning it into a massive floating target. The Japanese illuminated the South Dakota with searchlights and began pounding it mercilessly. But while the Japanese were focused on the crippled South Dakota, Admiral Lee on the USS Washington used his cutting-edge SG microwave radar to track the Kirishima in the pitch black. At a range of 8,400 yards, the Washington unleashed a devastating barrage from its 9 16-inch guns. The radar-directed fire was flawlessly accurate. In a matter of minutes, the Washington slammed at least 9 16-inch armor-piercing shells and over 40 5-inch shells into the Kirishima. The Japanese battleship was blown apart, its steering wrecked and its hull completely gutted by internal fires. It sank shortly after, marking the first time an American battleship had destroyed an enemy battleship in a one-on-one duel using radar. The Japanese transport convoy, now completely unprotected, was systematically slaughtered by American aircraft the following morning. While the Steel Titans tore each other apart on the ocean, a different, much slower kind of death was consuming the men on the island. The ground campaign on Guadalcanal was ultimately decided not by grand tactical maneuvers, but by the unforgiving mathematics of logistics and disease. The Japanese called Guadalcanal the Island of Death, and for good reason, because the Tokyo Express could only deliver a fraction of the necessary supplies. The Japanese 17th Army was starving to death. A modern infantryman in combat requires between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day simply to maintain his body weight and combat effectiveness. By December of 1942, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were surviving on less than 500 calories a day. They were reduced to eating roots, grass, and lizards. This catastrophic logistical collapse mirrors Napoleon Bonaparte's disastrous retreat from Moscow in 1812. Just as the French Grande Armée was decimated by the freezing Russian winter and a total lack of supply lines, the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was hollowed out by the punishing jungle environment. Disease killed far more men than American bullets. Malaria, carried by the millions of mosquitoes breeding in the fetid swamps, ravaged both sides. But the Americans had a steady supply of atabrine, a bitter, yellow pill that suppressed the symptoms of malaria, even though it temporarily turned the skin of the Marines a sickly shade of yellow. The Japanese had almost no medical supplies. Jungle rot ate away at their feet, and dysentery dehydrated them until they were nothing but walking skeletons. American patrols probing into the jungle began finding entire Japanese units dead in their defensive positions. having simply starved to death while clutching their rifles. How did the United States manage to sustain its forces thousands of miles from home while the Japanese starved in their own backyard? The answer lies in the terrifying industrial mobilization of the American economy. While Japanese shipyards were struggling to replace the destroyers and cruisers lost in Ironbottom Sound, American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than the Japanese could track them. These ugly, mass-produced cargo ships were the unsung heroes of the Pacific War. They carried the bulldozers, the barbed wire, the artillery shells, and the millions of pounds of canned spam and powdered eggs that kept the American war machine moving. The Japanese economy, heavily dependent on imported oil and raw materials, was being slowly strangled, while the American economy was just clearing its throat. Furthermore, the American command possessed a massive, invisible advantage in the form of intelligence. The Allied codebreakers, operating out of Station Haipo in Hawaii, were regularly decrypting Japanese naval communications. We knew when the Tokyo Express was sailing. We knew what route they were taking, and we knew what ships were involved. This signals intelligence was brilliantly augmented by the coast watchers. These were a handful of incredibly brave Australian, British, and New Zealand intelligence officers, along with hundreds of loyal native Solomon Islanders, who hid in the jungles of the surrounding islands. Equipped with heavy primitive radios, they watched the Japanese airfields and naval bases. Whenever a Japanese bomber formation took off from Rabaul, the coast watchers would radio a warning to Henderson Field. This gave the American Wildcat pilots precious time to climb to altitude and ambush the Japanese bombers, completely negating the element of surprise. The strategy employed by General Alexander Vandegrift on the ground and Admiral William Halsey at sea was a masterpiece of positional attrition. They held the vital center at Henderson Field and forced the Japanese to bleed themselves dry trying to take it. This relentless, grinding strategy is a perfect 20th century reflection of Union General Ulysses S. Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864. Grant knew that the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia could not replace its casualties, so he locked Robert E. Lee in a death grip, trading casualties until the Confederate Army collapsed. Halsey and Vandegrift did the exact same thing to the Japanese Empire. They turned Guadalcanal into a strategic black hole that sucked in and destroyed the absolute best pilots, sailors, and infantrymen the Japanese military had to offer. By January of 1943, the Japanese High Command finally accepted the bitter reality. They could not hold the island. In a brilliantly executed, stealthy evacuation known as Operation K, Japanese destroyers managed to extract about 10,000 starving survivors under the cover of darkness. When American forces advanced in early February, expecting a fanatical final stand, they found nothing but empty camps and unburied corpses. On February 9th, 1943, Major General Alexander Patch, who had taken over command of the island from Vandegrift, radioed Admiral Halsey with a simple message: Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month nightmare was over. The cost of this victory was staggering. The waters surrounding the island held the wrecks of over 50 Allied and Japanese warships, a graveyard of twisted steel, and thousands of entombed sailors. The Japanese lost over 24,000 men on the ground, the vast majority to starvation and disease, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The United States lost about 1,600 men killed in ground combat, and nearly 5,000 sailors at sea. But the strategic calculus of the Pacific War was permanently altered. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese Empire was an unstoppable, expanding juggernaut. After Guadalcanal, they would never launch another major strategic offensive in the Pacific. They were forced onto the defensive, retreating island by Bloody Island, all the way back to the home islands of Japan. War is rarely won by the side with the most fanatical warriors. It is almost always won by the side that can master the brutal, unglamorous mechanics of supply, production, and technological adaptation. The bones resting at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound, and beneath the roots of the mahogany trees on Bloody Ridge, serve as a permanent testament to the cost of that mastery. Thank you for joining us in the trenches today. Which factor do you believe was the absolute most critical to the American victory on Guadalcanal? A. The overwhelming industrial capacity to replace lost ships and supply the troops. B. The technological superiority of American radar in the decisive night naval battles. C. The stubborn, unbreakable grit of the Marines holding Henderson Field against human wave attacks. Let me know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below. And make sure you are subscribed for our next deep dive into the crucible of military history.